Good evening. Welcome to the SAFM Market Update with Moneyweb. My name is Zico Ngabadeli. In this special edition of the show, we're in conversation with business leader, chairman of Zico, and head of the Black Business Council, Sandile Zungu, who's going to share with us his journey in the world of business. Sandile, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me here, Siki.
Take us a little bit back to your background. Who is Sandile Zungu?
Well, I'm a son of the working class parents. My mom was a staff nurse at a clinic at Umlazi. My father used to work for Engine Refinery in Durban. So I come from a township called Umlazi. That's where I grew up. I went to schools there up until matric, when I was offered a scholarship to do engineering at UCT. But first I had to do post-matric at Hilton College, which I did in 1984. Okay. And then 85 to 88, I was doing engineering at UCT, which I completed, and then I started working in 1989.
Wow. And growing up, you have, I suppose, your mother in a profession. You know, nursing was one of those really well-respected professions. My grandmother was a nurse, so I remember the prestige that came with that. And then your father working at a refinery. How do you think that shaped your thinking as a young person?
Like, you're absolutely correct. I mean, those days, being born of a nurse brought with it a lot of pride and confidence as a young person. You know, my father was a very hard-working, working-class person. On Sundays, they ensured that they literally shepherded us to church. Yeah. So you grew up in that kind of environment where the church was a very important institution in one's life. My father, you know, would bring drums full of Vaseline because he worked in that warehouse in Engine. And my mom would bring empty bottles from the suppose dispensary at a polyclinic, and ours was to load Vaseline onto the bottles and then go around the township selling them.
They put you to work.
Exactly, put us to work so we earned our living. But I think what that really did, without even being aware that I was being educated about the art of closing a deal, I was being educated about debtors, bad debts, and debt collection, and so on, and about timing, when to do the marketing and when to do the selling, and all of those, you know, elementary experiences have from time to time come to mind when I have to take certain decisions. You know, of course, complex decisions, but the learnings and the lessons are very much the same.
And it's the basics, that's the foundation.
Absolutely.
All right, so you studied mechanical engineering?
Yes, I did mechanical engineering at the University of Cape Town. And then in 1995, 6 years later, once I had completed, I did a master's in business administration at University of Cape Town as well. Yeah. And then in 2000, I decided to go and study at Harvard University. I did a 4-month program called Program for Global Leadership. Its content was almost MBA-like. The only difference, Harvard is a case study learning type of institution. And I think the important thing as well, it was about networks. Yes. The kind of relationships I forged at Harvard, which I continue to hold today, the value thereof far outweighed the cost of doing that program.
How different was that world to being at UCT, being in South Africa, particularly in those days?
Look, 1995 to 2000, the world almost changed. The World Wide Web, WWW, the internet, really took off, which meant the use of internet as a learning tool was a lot more meaningful 5 years later when I went to do the program at Harvard, and the use of emails even featured quite prominently, to the extent that the networks that we formed then, we did not have to go back and rehash because there was now a new tool.
Yes.
We just continued to maintain that and improved. So that was very fundamental, especially given that I chose to do that Harvard program, really just to expose myself to the world and to form international networks. So it served that purpose in the main. But as for the content, I mean, Harvard is a truly international university. I have some criticism which I leveled at Harvard even that time, that most of the case studies were either America-based or Europe-based.
Yeah.
Africa just didn't quite exist in terms of corporate experience, which I thought they shortchanged themselves. Because now when we talk about Africa as an evolving, as a developing story, it takes them by surprise because they did not know that there is business in Africa, because they never did case studies on Africa.
And today, with, as you say, the so-called Africa Rising, we've got the World Economic Forum in Africa coming up in June as well. Every time they come there, it's almost like they rediscover the continent in a different way.
It's tough on them. That's why they are lagging behind the Chinese. That's why they are lagging behind the Indians in terms of finding opportunities in Africa. That's why they are lagging behind the Europeans, who obviously have a particular colonial experience with us, but they know the continent much better than the Americans. And Harvard University, I found, despite its greatness in many regards, I found it to be very lacking in terms of exposing Africa.
Right. Let's talk about your time at African Merchant Bank. That was part of NAIL. You were actually involved in the financial transaction that led to the Jonic takeover. Were you aware of the significance of it at that time?
I was absolutely not aware. You remember in 1996, how old was I? I was 29. And I remember the day my boss then, Rob Dow, called us to a meeting. Says, we've got a very important announcement to make. Cyril Ramaphosa is joining NAIL.
Yeah.
And I said, this is a game changer. I was very, very excited. Because here was a person that I revered, that I looked at in absolute awe. And he was going to be in my backyard, because NAIL owned African Merchant Bank. Yeah. And therefore he was going to be my client. He was going to be advised by me and my team at African Merchant Bank. So when they ultimately constituted what was then called the National Empowerment Consortium, with African Merchant Bank advising them on how to close this deal, how to negotiate and how to structure the funding for it. I knew that this transaction was different. It was catapulting me to a different level. But I never quite knew the full implications thereof. And even how many years, 20 years later, that Jonic takeover by the National Empowerment Consortium was indeed a game changer. I'm not so sure if as intended beneficiaries, we took proper and full advantage of it.
Yeah. All right. In conversation today with Sandile Zungu, chairman of Zico, he's head of the Black Business Council. We're talking to him about his journey in the world of business, and I want to chat to you about BEE today. We can do that in a moment. You're listening to SAFM, South Africa's news and information leader. This is the SAFM Market Update with Moneyweb. Today, in conversation with business leader, chairman of Zico, head of the Black Business Council, Sandile Zungu, sharing with us his journey in the world of business and, of course, his views on the future of South Africa's economy. Now, in the context, Sandile, of that Jonic deal, and like you were saying, it really was a significant deal in its time, but it was one of those few at that time that heralded the direction that Black economic empowerment was going to take. If you had to look back today, would you say that there were mistakes made, or was it what was needed at the time?
Well, let's first talk about its significance. I like that prodding. You know, Jonik, remember, it was a very broad church. In it, there were trade unions like mine workers, the clothing workers, SAC2, the transport workers, SARU at the time, which is now called SATAU. And then on the business side were giants like Nail at the time, Real Africa, Siphumelele, Semonsi and Company, and so on and so forth. The individual players in that consortium, it was really the who is who in the zoo, as it were. There were people like Dr. Ntato Motlana, Professor Wiseman Kuhlu, Putuma Nhleko, Patrice Motsepe, Mashudu Ramano, Irene Chanley, just to mention a few. Just about everyone who was in business or who was aspiring to be in business at the time was in a consortium one with the other. People like Maponya, Jackson Pafudi, you know, and a whole lot of others. So these are people who today most people are wondering, where do they come from? How do they come to where they are now? Patrice was part of the National Empowerment Corporation, which comprised smaller players who were outside of the likes of Nail worldwide. And he decided very quickly that this was not a game for him. He set off to establish his name in the mining space. And they said the rest is history. Mistakes were made because if you think about Jonik, I think at that time it was about 3.5 billion rands transaction.
A lot of money at that time.
It was 3.4 billion rands transaction plus the 6% which was set for the broad base. So I think it was about 4.1 billion rands transaction. Even in today's terms, that's quite a substantial transaction. But more significant was what was in Jonik. There was MTN, there was MultiChoice, there was independent newspapers. I think the Argus at the time. I may be making a mistake. It was not Argus. It was Times Media, John Com, which is the Sunday Times, not the independent component. There was Premier Foods, Premier Milling and the rest. And SA Breweries was there. Not the whole of it, but a small portion. If you look at some of these entities, the sum of the parts today, I will argue that the 35% or so that we were acquiring on behalf of the National Empowerment Consortium in Jonik, which was, as I said, was about 4.1 billion rands. That possibly could be worth about 200 billion rands today. If we had managed the process correctly, unbundled what needed to be unbundled, sold and liquidated and reinvested the monies appropriately where that needed to be done. But almost 2 years was wasted among the consortium trying to deal with governance issues. There was a lot of falling out among the NEC players because they didn't have coherence in terms of what needed to be done with Jonik, to the extent that there were very few winners in that transaction.
And that was the question I was going to ask. Who benefited? And with hindsight, who could have benefited?
Look, the pension funds who backed the Empowerment Consortium, if they held on to their shares, they would certainly have benefited. The large life assurers, if they held on to those shares, once unbundled and sold, they will have benefited. But those who were using third-party funds behind SPVs, they lost money. They didn't gain anything. The people who, I will argue, that the people who really benefited are those that left with MTN, who basically moved themselves from Jonik to an operating entity called MTN. And at the time when MTN was really rising very fast, I think those are the people who will have made something out of the Joburg transaction.
Do you think with current legislation around BEE, lessons were actually learned then from the mistakes made?
Well, what was learned is that empowerment can never be limited to just ownership. And that people own a significant number of shares does not mean that they are therefore necessarily interested in transforming the operational, the management structures. It's not in their interest at times to even worry and concern themselves with who gets promoted, how many women they have. As long as they have employees who perform and they're able to liquidate the debt they have, they're happy. You've got to make it an imperative for them to transform the leadership operational structures. Also, what we learned is that once a company is owned and controlled by blacks, it does not mean that the SMME players will necessarily benefit from the supply chain of those companies. And it does not mean that they will actually be a lot more conscientious in dealing with the needs of the communities that they serve, and therefore that the CSI budget will be a lot more generous. It does not mean those things. So the idea of a balanced scorecard on empowerment is one of the lessons that we picked from the Joburg experience, and is evolving.
In conversation with Sandile Zungu, we continue that in a moment. This is our special edition of the SAFM Market Update with the Moneyweb, in conversation with Sandile Zungu. Sandile, how did Zico come about?
In 1996 or 97, I was asked by a trade union, SARU, South African Railway and Harbour Workers Union, to start an investment company for them. They're part of the National Empowerment Consortium, but they wanted to participate directly as a union, not through their pension fund. So they're not interested in participating through Transnet Pension Fund, because that was not really benefiting them. It was benefiting the pensioners of Transnet and employees of Transnet who were not necessarily their members.
Yes.
So they said they wanted to participate directly. And so they asked me to present to their National Executive Committee meeting in Klerksdorp, and on how they should do that. At the time I was with AMB. And on my way back from Klerksdorp, I remember the president of SARU at that time, the treasurer at the time, Ezra Mapiana, he calls me and said, "Hey, Zungu, thank you for the motivation on how we can structure a company, but they said they will go ahead on condition you are the CEO." And I said, "Mapiana, it's quite flattering, but I'm not sure if that's what I want. I'm happy at African Merchant Bank." And they persisted. They even sent a delegation, comprising 3 of their leadership to say, "Zungu, we want," but the resolution of the NEC is that on condition Zungu drives the strategy. Long and short, the following year, I started SARU Investments, which I ran for almost 4 years. And then in 2002, I decided it was time that I did my own. That was now after I come back from Harvard and spent a year back at Nail. I decided in 2002 I'm going to start my own company. I'd been there, I'd done it. There was nothing new that I would have to try, other than that I was now building my own balance sheet and doing it as a principal. So in 2002 I opened the doors of Zico, and I've enjoyed myself up to today.
What have been your major investments?
Well, I've got a number of investments. People ask me, what is Zico's business? And I said, simply put, Zico's business is to buy, build businesses, and then sell them. So businesses are stock to me. I nurture them. It's like chicken. You buy them thin, you feed them, they gain 2 or 3 pounds, and then you dispose of them and you make a profit. And of course, sometimes when you're growing chicks, some die. Others, when you decide to sell them, the price per kilo of chicken is not as attractive as when you decide to grow them. So it's a mixed bag. But currently, I've got a company called Springlights Gas, which supplies methane-rich gas to industry in the main in KwaZulu-Natal. We transport gas on a compressed form from Secunda, which we buy from Sasol Gas, and then we dispose it to our clients. It's a significant business, is growing. It's in a nice space. We have entities like Taquanta, which is an asset management business. It's got about 90 billion rands worth of assets under management, and it's growing. We've got companies like Innovation Group, which are into management, for example, among others, management of third-party warranty programs for automotive sector. It's a mixed bag of really solid companies in the services space. We also have some mining exposure on the coal, gold, diamond space.
All right, so if you look at where we are now as a country, we've got our lovely, I think it's the only country that calls it load shedding, but we have load shedding. We are very good at coming up with names. We have a weak rand that it seems our manufacturers are just unable to turn into, to profits, to growth of the sector and so on. We've had labor issues. It feels a little bit depressing. What do you think of the state of our economy right now?
Well, I'm absolutely not depressed. I'm not depressed at all. I think we have challenges. Challenges, we have them. There are plenty. If you look at the picture in one of the weekend newspapers of a guy, on the verge of stabbing another one, it can only be depressing. There are many incidents that cause a great deal of concern. But the most important thing is, where do we come from and what path have we set for ourselves? If you look at where we were in 1990, there was blood on the floors in Johannesburg, in Soweto, in Merafe, in the Soshanguve, in Durban townships. The country was burning. 25 years later, we're a very stable country by and large. We are building houses. We are talking about NSFAS to take kids from disadvantaged backgrounds to higher education. We're building new universities. We're renewing rolling stock. We're putting new carriages to expand our export capacity. There are a whole lot of wonderful things that are happening. Yes, the vision that Mandela espoused is being blotted by the xenophobia events. But where do we go? I mean, you have the National Development Plan, which has got very simple targets, but very impressive targets. We want to create 11 million jobs. We want to reduce poverty. We want to reduce inequality. We want to grow the economy. And we want to double, for example, the income capabilities of South Africans. Those are wonderful targets. That's where we're going. It's not going to be a straight line to that. It's not even utopia, because these are all realistic targets to that 2030 state. It's not going to be a straight line. There will be peaks and troughs. But I hope that when we look back in 2030, we'll see that where we are today in 2015, which looks very challenging, will have been a shadow of where we are then.
Change is quite painful. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Chairman of Zico, business leader, head of the Black Business Council, Sandile Zungu, thank you so much for your time today. And that brings us to the end of this special edition of the SAFM Market Update with Moneyweb. Goodbye.